Anna, welcome. Today we are going to talk about creativity. And you make a really good point in that a lot of creativity is restricted to arts and crafts, even though creativity shows up everywhere in real life. So, for example, at my school, there was a teacher named Miss Price. None of us liked Miss Price. Miss Price was the worst. And she was the art teacher. And she was pretty negative and just sad and lacked energy. And what ended up happening was we would go there and that would be where creativity would happen. And then the rest of school was very rote and analytical. And I think what you're saying is, hey, creativity actually shows up everywhere. There's creativity in business, there's creativity in writing, there's creativity in math. There should be creativity in all parts of school. And we shouldn't just relegate creativity to one small part of the student curriculum.
Yep, that's something that's been on my mind a lot lately, especially because growing up, I didn't really consider myself the creative type, which surprises me because it took me so many years to realize that I was very creative. I'm just creative, not necessarily in the way that they teach you in school that you're creative. So, before we started the podcast, I was kind of like walking you through this idea that to me, and then I saw this over again in my classroom as well, creativity was kind of like what was in the box labeled the arts in the classroom. That box that's like in the corner that once a week your teacher will let you go and play with that, and there are different brushes and paint and maybe some props, and then they tell you, okay, go ahead and create something. And then of course all the artists would go there and people that were crafty, and I was not really crafty and I was not very artsy. So to me, it was always kind of like intimidating, and that's what I would see as being creative. But then nobody ever told me, or nobody ever emphasized that I was very creative. Whenever I would dance, whenever I would come up with things, whenever I would be, even when I was imitating different people in TV, that I loved to do that as a kid, or anything that I would come up with that was new to me and useful to me, that is being creative. But that's something that is not really stressed in school. And then I realized this when I was teaching, and kids would often come to me and tell me, well, I don't consider myself the creative type. And I was always impressed because those were the kids that were the most creative. Maybe they were not artsy, but they were really creative. And it made me realize that if we change this narrative or this story, and we start making kids realize that the moment that they're creating anything, whether it is a piece of writing, whether it is a design, or they came up with a new song, or they're telling a new joke, or anything that they come up with that is useful and new to them, and they're using it in a new way, that is being creative. So kind of like change that story so that kids believe that they are creators and they are producers, so that they lose that fear and they can actually start producing things, especially when they see that white piece of paper and they don't know what to do.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to change that perspective.
I think that a lot of the definition of creativity that I think we can run with here is maps. So creativity is when there is no map. So we have this saying, me and some friends, called the person with the map. And basically what it means is as the world changes and as you begin to think about things, say in business is a perfect example here, certain people have a map of where things are going and they just understand what the landscape actually looks like. And in order to do that, you have to create something in your brain. And I've always liked that there is, like, you could distinguish the world into people who like following maps that already exist and people who like creating new maps. And school's very good at teaching people to follow maps that already exist. Here's the test, here's the words that you have to memorize, this is what is due at the end of the semester. And actually, I was really bad at that because most of the points that I got off in school were, hey, you didn't follow the directions. And I was like, I swear I followed the directions. I swear. And then my teacher would show me what I submitted and I blatantly missed something. Like, it would say, hey, you need to have 2 double paragraph spaced essays. And I'd be like, I did 1.5. Or it needed to be 500 words and I somehow wrote 300 or something like that. I missed those points all the time. But I think that what you're saying here is that rather than creativity being on this spectrum between, say, hyper-analytical and then arts and crafts, so you could say things that are maybe more intuitive, maybe, intuitive and sort of colorful versus very symbolic and abstract, then
Mm-hmm.
that's how we think about it in school. But really, that's just the totally wrong spectrum, because there are people like Eric Weinstein, for example. I really like his podcast, and he's a mathematician, but he's so creative. Like,
Yep.
what he's really good at is creating new maps. And he
Mm-hmm.
has said, actually, the map of economics is wrong. And he and his wife collaborated on this new economics theory called gauge theory, which is a new way of thinking about what's happening in economics. Same thing in physics, where he thinks that Einsteinian physics and Newtonian physics, like, we already know that they don't match up, and he thinks that the entire bedrock of contemporary physics is preventing us from finding new insights in the world. And those are parts of the world that school would say, oh, those aren't creative areas, but he's going
Mm-hmm.
out and being very creative. And of course, we need more people like that.
Absolutely. And you know what? That reminds me also of another thing, another story, another narrative that's going around. It's been going around in schools a lot with regard to creativity. And you were one of the people that actually helped me dismantle this, which is this idea that in order to be creative, you need to come up with something that's completely original.
Mm-hmm.
And when I joined your course, Rite of Passage, one of my biggest barriers with creating pieces of writing was that I was like, well, what if my content's not original? What if it's not brand new? Like, I need to sit down and come up with something entirely new. And you were like, no, no, no. Actually, creativity can also be, assembling different ideas that are already out there, but then putting, in your own twist, your own interpretation, and then you add your flair and how you see those ideas combined, and then you put something out there and you're creating something, and that is creativity. So also this notion of originality, like, I feel like in schools they emphasize that a lot, especially with the whole topic of plagiarism and this and that, to the point where kids are scared to even try to grab different things to come up with something, because they're scared, oh wait, no, then the moment I do that, it's going to be wrong, and I'm going to be, points are going to be taken off because I'm plagiarizing, or because this is not completely original. So also trying to change that mentality in kids and tell them, like, wait, no, like you, if this is new to you, and if you added your own flair and your own interpretation, it doesn't matter where you pulled this from, right? Like, you're coming up with something, and you're saying it differently. So also that aspect, like, not only the spectrum that you were saying of artsy and not so art, like, also the original part. Like, we need to reframe that and explain that so that kids lose that fear and can actually, like, start creating things. Because I've noticed that's been a big barrier. Whenever, for example, in summer camp, the first days that we were doing different things in summer camp, you would feel a little resistance from the kids' side, because they're not sure what I mean by create something. They all have different definitions of creativity, which is fine, but some of them were going with this myths, and that was impeding them from creating. And I had to, like, coach them and walk them through and say, wait, no, what you're doing is creative. What your idea is original. It's just original in this new way. So it's just a very interesting thing that I've been noticing in kids.
Yeah, it's funny because Silicon Valley is held up as this beacon of innovation, and most of the Silicon Valley companies aren't really inventing entirely new things. So, Bitcoin, for example, which wasn't a Silicon Valley company invention, but that comes out of work that was done in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and then in the early 2000s, there were different coins, basically, types of currency before, Hashcash and BitGold, and Bitcoin was born out of a lot of those experiments. And what happened was, basically, there were all of these intellectual building blocks. So there was something called the Cyberpunk Manifesto that came out in the 1990s. Then there were a lot of the mathematical proofs that came out in the 70s and the 80s. And then, like I said, BitGold and Hashcash. And Bitcoin built on top of a lot of those things, but it just recombined them in new ways. There's that great quote from Thomas Edison where he says, I haven't failed, I just found 10,000 things that didn't work. And I think that a lot of innovation happens like that. Now, with that said, I think it is important to have what Peter Thiel calls 0 to 1 innovations. And what those are is when you don't have something, then you do have something, versus, so he distinguishes between vertical and horizontal innovation. So like a vertical is like a leap up, and that is what he calls 0 to 1. And then a horizontal one is like globalization, where we come up with an innovation and we spread it all around the world. And I think that the thing is, if you look at the history of experimentation, a lot of it is what you could just call are happy accidents and just weird serendipity. I always joke that a lot of my mistakes are often the most creative things that I end up finding. And it is from this desire, this desperate desire to tweak and to try to come up with new ideas and to find new little insights and patterns that are revealed into the world, where I find that I've made some kind of creative breakthrough. But often creative breakthroughs only really show up in retrospect. And what I can't get away from, though, is this idea of the open map versus closed map. That even in the creative classes, so if I went into art class, it was very clear, oh, this is what you have to do today. It's going to be perfectly boxed, and we're going to tell you exactly what to do. You're going to be doing ceramic this week. You're going to be doing painting next week. And as somebody who wasn't a good painter, I was like, oh, I'm not creative at all. But really, it is about the map thing. Like, I'm very good in spaces with open maps, and school didn't really help me with that. And to get back to summer camp, what I find very interesting is that a lot of our campers, they want more structure. They want answers from you. They want to know exactly how to be thinking, what to think, what to do. And we're pushing back against so much institutional weight to try to say you can play in an open map. And that's actually what I find to be the most human thing that there is.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it reminds me of, remember that example that I shared with you that I recently came across of how Lego became successful. Remember that I shared with you?
Yeah.
I think it was like a week ago. And it's a great metaphor for exactly what you're saying, which is kids, that resistance that we saw, for example, in summer camp, but really we see it everywhere, right? Like where kids are like giving instructions, tell me what to do. It's because we've conditioned them to do that. Like that's exactly what happens in school. And then I love the Lego example. I mean, I didn't know about this before, but when they first started, it was very open-ended. You know, they had like this all-purpose Lego sets where they would come in this box and you would throw them in the floor. And then kids would just build something, anything that was in their mind, they would create it, right? There were no instructions. There was no picture in the box that said, this is what you're creating. No, like you could build whatever your imagination, wherever your imagination would take you. And then they didn't do well. And this is very surprising at first. I was like, wow, they didn't do well. And the reason why they didn't do well was because it didn't match what parents were expecting and what kids had been trained to do in school. So what I mean by that is like they ended up changing from this like all-purpose Lego sets to predefined kits, right? Where they have the picture in the front and they have like very clear step-to-step instructions that you need to follow in order to come up with the final product, right? And then that is a great metaphor for what happens in schools. In schools, teachers and curriculum designers and educators, everyone's over-engineering the material and the curriculum that we're giving kids to the point where we are removing that opportunity for them to be creative and come up with things and solve problems and just giving them instructions. And you see this over and over again in schools where kids are sitting down and they wait for the teacher to tell them what to do. And then even when the teacher tries to be quiet for a little while, the kid already knows that eventually the teacher will give in and tell you the answer or tell you what you need to do.
All the time.
It's right, and this is what happened. And then when Lego did this and they changed their strategy, they became super popular because this is what people are used to. This is what's happening in school. So, everyone knows what to do. There's one real, right answer. So you build something and it's done and you feel that satisfaction and that's it. And it's crazy because kids are going into this world where they need to be creators and producers and come up with solutions to problems that don't come with instructions. But then in school, they train you to do everything with instructions. So it's this discrepancy that you see there, like, well, what are we doing? Like, no wonder kids go out and they feel lost and they, don't really know what to do because sometimes there are people not telling you what to do, right, in different jobs whenever you need to be creative. So I just thought that analogy was just crazy. Well,
yeah, Seth Godin talks about the difference between the law of the Mechanical Turk and the law of linchpin leverage. And I think that to just provide some structure to what you're saying, how you need to go out and be creative, I think that he absolutely nails it here. So basically, Mechanical Turk was a platform that spun out of Amazon. And what it allowed you to do was take any project and just give it to somebody, and it could be like 50 cents or $1. And their minimum wage wasn't a big thing because you could hire people from all over the world. And basically, what Seth says is that any project, if you break it down into parts that are small enough and those parts are actually predictable, well, they can be accomplished for basically close to free. And so as you get more predictability, then you basically are turning and competing against the machine. Like if you're doing closed map work, like things that are perfectly mapped, machines do that. That is what computers do. That is what automation is. We take things that are perfectly mapped and we make them have robots do it. And basically what he says is if you get to a place where there's that much structure, then what ends up happening is then what happens is automation and human labor intersect, and the people are just doomed because nobody can compete against a computer that doesn't sleep at night. Nobody can compete against a computer who never gets in bad moods. Nobody can compete against a computer who say they're doing physical labor, whose arms don't get tired. So that's what then we're training people to do. I worry that we're actually training people to get to a place where their work is going to be automated. And I can't think of a worse thing to build education around. So that's called the law of the Mechanical Turk, that any project broken down into sufficiently small and predictable parts can be accomplished for close to free. So what's the alternative? Well, he calls it the law of linchpin leverage. And basically, what that is open bounded work. That is the sort of stuff, if you walk into any company, there's one person, there's a linchpin who holds the company together, who if they don't have the ideas, nobody else will. There's one person these are people who are in open map spaces. They are trying to come up with new ideas that nobody else would come from or would come up with. And this is what's really interesting. People talk about, in software engineering, they talk about the 10x engineer, they talk about the 100x engineer. If you find somebody who's actually creative moments are singular. They can never be replicated again. And this is why progress is so lumpy. It depends on certain groups of creative people who come together, like the Scottish Enlightenment was like this. Part of like Florence and the Renaissance was like this. There was a group with J.R.R. Tolkien who wrote Lord of the Rings, and C.S. Lewis who wrote Chronicles of Narnia, and they were like best friends and they were helping each other out. There are places like Stanford and Silicon Valley that have birthed a lot of really interesting people. So you have groups that can be really creative, and then you can have individuals who can be really creative. And a truly creative act will never be replicated again. Like if it is sufficiently creative, there is nobody else who could have done that. And that means that it gets back to that 0 to 1 creativity, and no ordinary person could do that. And so that isn't like 10x engineer, that's not 100x engineer, that is like infinity x engineer. And I think that's what we should be focused on in our schools, because what I see the future of at least many parts of the economy being, as it pertains to knowledge work, I mean, I live this every day. Like, what the most efficient way to run a company is you come up with stuff in open bounded spaces, then you get to a place where you define it more and more concrete task, and then you give it to a assistant or somebody like that, and they just aren't paid nearly as well. Now, those assistants can still have great lives and stuff like that, but I think that the amount of creative work that we need in the economy is growing very fast, because ultimately that is how you're not going to be competing against computers. Do you know about the saying above the API or below the API? Do you know this saying?
Mm-hmm.
So basically what it is that an API basically it's called the application programming interface, and it connects different software programs together. And there are people who tell computers what to do, and there's people who are told what to do by computers. And if you are somebody who tells computers what to do, your earning potential and also the leverage on your decisions is going to be so much higher, which means that you are much more likely to be able to do what you want to do with your time. Whereas if you're told what to do by computers, a computer is just saying this is slightly too hard for me to actually take on, but it's simple enough and well defined enough that I can tell you exactly what to do. And if you won't do it, somebody else will. And that's a really tricky place to be in the economy.
You were actually the one who told me about this example earlier. But yeah, I completely agree, and that's exactly what schools are doing, right? They're still going through that process of telling you what to do, so that kids leave expecting for people to tell them what to do. And like you said, we need more creators. Like right now, the ability to think and act creatively is more important than ever. And that's why I keep saying, and why we talk about this a lot, that really the role of schools and of teachers right now is to create the conditions for invention. And that means like we need to rethink the space, we need to rethink the way we're doing things. Like it's just completely different. Like it cannot be adding something to the curriculum or adding something to the day or no. Like it's just like rethinking the entire thing. And right now, teachers need to really take a step back and just see, okay, what does the kid need? What materials? How do I set up that it's conducted for invention and for making? And they really need to start figuring these things out. And that's not happening in schools. Like it's really rare. And kids are there for so many years, and then they go out, and then they're expected to create, and they don't really know how to do it because, like you said, they've been told what to do the entire time. So that's one thing that we really take into account in Rite of Passage Summer Camp. Like, how do we create? Like, our job is to create the conditions for invention, create the conditions for kids to be able to create and to make. And that's a challenging task, and they're not used to it. But it's that's what they need. They need more of that. Right?
Do you worry that a lot of teachers are teaching kids how to be teachers? I mean, I saw this over and over again, that the way I learned to write in college was so that I could go be an academic. The way that I learned to do things was so I could just be like the teacher. And I don't really blame teachers. I mean, fundamentally, when you teach somebody, almost inherently, you're training them to be like you. That's almost what teaching is. But at the same time, it's quite concerning that kids are growing up learning how to be teachers. And as an industry, teachers are some of the most frustrated people that I know. They are underpaid, overworked, and generally just almost like martyrs, just so unsatisfied, feeling like they're just sacrificing their lives for something bigger, which I really respect. But I think that as we think about summer camp, that's something that I really don't want to do. I don't want to get to a place where we're training people how to then be the teachers of the future. And luckily, I think one of the things that we have is, as entrepreneurs ourselves, we're actually living at the frontier of this economy. And I think that that's one of the big reasons why students feel that they're just learning to be future teachers, is because that's exactly what it is. And teachers aren't entrepreneurs. They don't have the experience of running a business. They don't have the experience of trying to live in the knife fight that can be the knowledge economy, but then also on the flip side to see the tremendous value that can be unlocked, because for them, scale is teaching to 20 students instead of 10, or 100 instead of 20 when you're talking to the public. But now with teachers like on YouTube, with teachers in parts of Asia like South Korea, those teachers are teaching thousands and thousands of people at a time, and they're entrepreneurs. They're not really just teachers.
Right. And there's a lot to unpack there. But remember that in schools, with all the, like even if the teacher's really creative and wants to do things certain ways, like I was a teacher for a long time, you need to do what the school asks you to do, right? So really all we're doing when we're teaching from a curriculum is teaching kids how to be imitators. That's the reality. Like, that's what we're doing in schools. Like, this is what you need to do. This is how it's been done before. This is what good writing looks like. Go ahead and imitate this. This is what, the way that you solve this math problem. And even if a kid's like, wait, no, I didn't think about it that way. You're like, no, well, this is the way. And sometimes you teach different strategies, but ultimately, this is the way. And, we're always telling them how to do things in a way where they just have to imitate. I mean, they imitate and they do a good job imitating, then they get the good grade, and those are the good students. The students that are not good imitators and want to do things differently, then those are the ones that are considered, that they're doing the wrong thing, that they're not following instructions, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one thing. Schools are really teaching kids how to be imitated. So, when there's a curriculum in place that you need to teach, the teacher falls in this role, and that's what I got tired of, to be honest, like following a script. Like, you know exactly what you're going to teach and what the outcome is and where you need to take kids from the beginning to the end of the class, and there's like a path, right? And you have to go over that path. So inevitably, like, the teacher's just showing kids what to do and the kids are following along. And yeah, they're adopting all the skills that the teacher is doing, or they're supposed to, right? Some kids just don't. So it's just this really weird process where teachers are trying their best and they're spending so much time like doing everything like they're supposed to, and they have so many things that they need to do in a day. And then the kids are just there trying to consume, and imitate. So that's kind of like what we end up with. And it's really sad because teachers obviously, like, they work so hard and they want the best for the kids, and they really, generally want for the kids to learn. The problem is that inside this system, it's really difficult. It's really difficult because it's contrary to everything that we know about learning, about what kids are going to need in the future. So I mean, I feel bad. I feel bad because they're trying so hard and working so hard, but it's kind of like going against the current,
Yeah, exactly. So often in life, the times where often one of the things that you want to do is work less hard as like a instinct. Like, I think that what we do when something isn't working quite right, we try to crank the pedal. So like, like really crank the engine and see what it can do, and we'll overwork ourselves. And Adam Robinson, who is a mentor to me, he always says something that's so simple that it sounds like a truism, but he says, if you don't like the results that you're getting, change what you're doing. And what he always says is just try the opposite thing. And generally, in a system, if you all of a sudden just drop the amount of work that you're doing in half or something like that, and it all crumbles, and you have human labor that's holding up the system, then bad things are going to happen. And my worry is that what's happening in teaching is exactly this. Like, there's this system that is inherently broken. And so what we're doing is we're raising standards. We're saying, teachers, we need you to work more hours. We're saying, students, we need you to spend more time in class. We're saying, hey, we need to add rigor to our standardized tests. And that's what we're doing. We're like vrooming the school. And that is the opposite vision that you and I have. Our vision is of a much lighter touch, and it's sort of creating the conditions for creativity to emerge and for people to have these new ideas, and then to just from there then create like a new system that isn't so obsessed with standards. Because the fact of the matter is, and you wrote about this very well in your newsletter last Friday, standards, we just can't measure everything. We just can't. And there's this great line that not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. And I think about that a lot, where the world is just so complex, and our desperate plea to go measure what's happening and to make the world legible is a fool's errand. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't do it at all, but it means that very often our instincts about what to measure and how to measure steer us in the wrong direction.
And that's the whole thing. Like, schools, like all these things that they've added, what it's done is really you forget about the most fundamental parts of learning, which happen everywhere and are a lot more simple than we make them. Like, we're overcomplicating everything to the point where students and teachers and parents and everyone's stressed out, everyone's working super hard. And when you stop and think about it, what for? Isn't the whole purpose of school for kids to learn? And by adding all these things, kids are not learning. They're learning for the test. They're learning how to pass the test, but there's no genuine, meaningful learning. And there's a lot of studies that back this up. And so what we're trying to do is say, okay, let's remove all this nonsense. Let's remove all this nonsense and go back to basics. Let's go back to what's organic and what's simple and what kids do naturally, which is learn from everything. They learn by doing. They learn when they're interested. They learn when you let them go deeper into their curiosities. They learn when they have sufficient time to explore and to tinker and to talk and to, try again if it doesn't work. Like, that's what works. And that's something so simple that we've been doing for years. And then by adding all these standards and measures and all these obsessive things, we've lost that. And it's like we've lost track of what really matters. And the kids are really suffering by this. So we are trying to create a space where we remove all that we really don't like. I think that it's just affecting learning, right? And saying, okay, let's see what happens when you don't have all these pressures around you. What can you do? What can you create? And it's just incredible how much learning there is when you remove all these things and when you let kids explore and guide their own learning. It's incredible. It's incredible. But so many people have forgotten about this because of the way we've been doing things.
Ana Lorena Fabrega, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.